All right. Welcome to Games History Hour, a collaboration between the United States Olympic and Paralympic Museum and the International Society of Olympic Historians. I'm Lindsay Huban. I am the Chief Content and Integration Officer at the USOPM, located in Colorado Springs, Colorado. The museum celebrates the more than 13,000 incredible athletes who have competed for Team USA over the last 130 years. The International Society of Olympic Historians was founded in 1991 to promote and study the Olympic movement and the Olympic Games. Today, we have three fantastic panelists who will be delving into the history of the Olympic Winter Games. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bob Barney, who is the founder of the International Center for Olympic Studies at Western University. Dr. Barney has published over 300 scholarly pieces, including books, articles, papers, and more. Jason Sisney is a policy advisor and Olympic historian who is currently advising California legislators on preparations for the upcoming 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games in Los Angeles. And Blair. Bonnie is a six-time Olympic medalist in speed skating. She won 5 gold medals and 1 bronze, and she is the most decorated U.S. female Winter Olympian. And Bonnie was inducted into the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Hall of Fame in 2004. So each of these speakers today brings us really a great perspective on the Olympic Winter Games. And I would like to start with sort of a softball question, if you will. I would love to hear from each of you. What is your favorite moment from the Olympic Winter Games? So, Bob, do you want to share your favorite moment with us?
Well, lots of them. I've been to 12 Olympic Games now, dating back to 1976. But I think the one that was most climactic was certainly the Ben Johnson race in 1988 in Seoul, in which he won the gold medal and he didn't win the gold medal. That was very exciting. There's no doubt about that. But another one that the secondary one would have been one that most people wouldn't relate to, and that was the gold medal won by the bantamweight weightlifter from Turkey, who won 3 gold medals in succession, 3 different Olympics starting in Seoul and in 92 and in 96. And I was at the 96 weightlifting final. And the sidebar to that was the relationship between the Turkish crowd and the Greek crowd, because they were the two finalists that fought for the medal, and it was very close, very exciting, with all the rock music going on, and the president in the front row, Samaranch, and so those are two that I can cite.
Those are some pretty good moments. I imagine when you've been to that many games, it's hard to pick out just one or two favorites. So, Jason, what about you? Do you have a favorite Olympic Winter Games moment?
Well, when you brought up the question, my mind immediately went to Vancouver in 2010. Went with my family, and we ended up with some tickets to curling, women's curling, one night. And the curling venues at the Olympics are pretty small, and this place was absolutely electric. It was full of Team China fans from both Canada and China, as well as lots of others. The U.S. and Sweden were on the ice right in front of us, and it was just a really fun place to meet people, and it was just a really raucous venue for curling that night.
I imagine so. I imagine so. Bonnie, what about you? What is your favorite?
Well, I guess I have to say at least one of mine. And I think, the 500 in Calgary, winning that race, which actually wound up being in world record time. But I think doing something for the very first time has an unbelievable power and emotion behind it that's maybe a little bit hard to capture again. So, and not to say my other wins weren't thrilling and exciting, they all were in their own little way. But I think doing something that first time, that power behind it and that emotion was something that was hard to top. And if I go away from me, in 1994, when Dan Jansen won his Olympic race in the 1,000 meters after kind of stumbling in the 500, really his his signature event, if you will. I actually wasn't in the stadium because I was in the stadium during the 500s, but during the 1,000 meters, I had to race the next day. And during the 500, my pulse, like I was exhausted by the time I left the rink. And so I knew it would be too much for me to be there in the stadium with them. So, and watching, so I watched it back in our sports med little area and watching with some of my teammates, those the other girls that were going to be racing the next day, another person who would wind up being my future husband, and watching that, and we were just over the moon. But also, that's also a time before cell phones. So the way they all connected with each other was like through walkie-talkies. And the med staff was trying to get to Dan because he was going to have to go to drug testing. But one of the walkie-talkies was in our room, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to talk to him. Yes. I knew I wasn't going to see him before my race the next day. And so they were like, oh, there's someone really special who would like to talk to you. And he thought it was going to be the president of the United States, but no, it was just me. So that was a special moment that Dan and I had together. We grew up in the sport. Our families knew each other before we were born. So to really go through something with all the ups and the downs of the course of the years was kind of that walkie-talkie moment was very special for the both of us.
I imagine that would be so. And I don't think anybody blames you for saying that a favorite moment is one of yours. I think that I would probably question it if you didn't say that. So, well, thank you all for sharing that. There's so many wonderful moments from the past 100 years of Olympic Winter Games, and we're going to talk through some of those today. For those of you who are watching either on Zoom or on Facebook Live, you can put questions in the chat. We are going to do some Q&A towards the end of our hour today, so please feel free to put comments and questions there. I'd like to start by placing the Olympic Winter Games in a little bit of a historical context. So, Bob, can you give us just a quick overview? How did the Winter Games get started? How did they come about?
Well, they were certainly in the mind of Coubertin when he sat in 1894 in Paris when he convened the committee that established the IOC, because in his written minutes in French, the word patinage, the skating, appeared. There's no evidence to suggest that Coubertin was a winter athlete. He was a rugby enthusiast. There's no doubt about that, and he did some rowing, bicycling, and so on. But he was certainly in the 1890s when this occurred. He was certainly aware of the athletic festivals, the winter sports festivals that were going on in the Scandinavian countries in particular, and in Germany. And 20 years later, at the 20th reunion, their anniversary of the establishment of the Modern Olympic Games, or the Modern Olympic movement with the IOC, celebrated in Paris in 2014. In that session meeting, the words ice hockey, skating, and skiing came forth. And so there's some vision of that. Now, that may have been prompted by the fact that in 1908, when London celebrated the Summer Games, they actually had a figure skating event in a new ice surface that had been created for these games. And it was won by a Russian, not a Soviet yet, but a Russian skater. And when we fast forward just 6 years from there for the Antwerp Games and Summer Games in 1920 in Belgium, uh, figure skating was included in the program, in a specially built ice rink surface for them, and also a hockey tournament, very small but still included in the program. Now this was for the Summer Games, not winter. The watershed event occurred 4 years later at Chamonix in France, in the French Alps. And this, of course, was a meeting orchestrated by French amateur sport officials, not particularly the IOC. Uh, and but it comes off as the first as the first Winter Olympic Games, and and it was successful. There were a lot of, except financially, and this is the case of a lot of the early Olympic Games, with the tax bill following well, the bill, following on the organizers. Uh, and then from Chamonix, of course, we go to subsequent games. The second games were held in St. in Switzerland, and there Sonja Heine performed as an 11-year-old and finished last in the field. But after that, she would win in the summer the next Olympic Winter Games in Lake Placid, and again in Berlin in 1936. So there's sort of the introduction uh, to how the Winter Games came about, and became part of the modern Olympic movement.
Yeah. So for many years, the Summer Games and the Winter Games were held in the same year, and then they started alternating. Can you talk about that switch and what precipitated that?
Well, the exact date for the transfer, of course, we know it as the 92 Olympics and the 94 Winter Olympics, but the actual switch, the concept of the switch came about in 1986. And it was occasioned by an invitation that Samaranch, the president of the IOC, extended to Dennis Swanson, an ABC television executive who had succeeded Roone Arledge uh, as director of sports for the ABC network. Samaranch invited him to lunch in Lausanne, and when they got together, Samaranch was upset with all the taxations on energy and resources in one year, putting on the Olympic Games in the winter and putting on 6 months or 7 months later the Winter Games in the summer. And not only that, but Swanson himself was upset by the fact that the celebrating the games, both the winter and the summer games in one year, was a tremendous strain in the advertising industry and the prospects of selling advertising. And between the two of them, as the conversations went on at lunch, finally Swanson said, "Did you ever think of celebrating the Winter Games and not in the same year as the Winter Games?" And Samaranch said, "Yeah, gee, that's a good idea." And Samaranch, being Samaranch, retired to the executive committee and sold the idea. And 2 months later, when the IOC sessions met, uh, it was put to the IOC body, general session, all the membership, and they passed it unanimously. And so the switch came. The last games celebrated was 1992, when both winter and
Mhm.
summer games were held. And fortunately, Lillehammer was able to agree to be the first of the split times that the games were held, and brought off a marvelous contest. This was of tremendous benefit to the Winter Games, this in particular. Uh, they started out modestly in competition with the Summer Games for the revenues available and the advertising and selling rights, but this has steadily improved, and they're drawing much closer to being to reaching not parity with the Summer Games in terms of following and revenue production and so on. But nevertheless, that's how the how the system started, and I think everybody will applaud it to a great degree. I have, I know,
Yeah,
because here at the center we give a symposium every Olympic year. But when we started the center in 1989, we said, we're going to have a symposium every year, every Olympic year. It was every 4 years. And when it went to every 2 years, we went, gulped, and nevertheless swallowed it and did it. So we really we have profited from that too.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. And Bonnie, you competed in both of those games, didn't you, in 92 and 94?
Yeah, I was pretty lucky to be in that realm of the switch because, yes, I won two Olympic gold medals in 92. And then to have that 2 year switch, it made like, oh, yeah, do I want to keep going for sure? So if it had been 1998, would I have kept going? I mean, I'm not exactly sure and glad we don't have to know, but I was lucky enough to be able to be in that time of the switch. But I think too for the Winter Olympians, we were in a sense a warm up for the Summer Games. So we would, there'd be all this hype and lead up to the Winter Games, and as soon as closing ceremonies hit, boom, they were on to summer. So it really kind of gave the winter sports really their own year to stand on instead of kind of just being a warm up for the summer games. So I think it really did do a lot for the winter sports, the winter athletes, and as Bob said, like just all that goes with it, with the sponsors and everything else that comes along with putting two major events on so close to each other. So now being spread out definitely I think it's better for everybody all across the board.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Thank you for sharing that. So, well, Jason, I'd like to pivot to you for a couple minutes and talk about one Winter Games in particular. So can you tell us about the Squaw Valley, now called Palisades Tahoe Winter Games?
Yes. Well, I'm in Sacramento, California. The state of California was essentially the host jurisdiction for the 1960 Winter Games. So it's about 2 hours drive from here up in the Sierra. And they were only the second Winter Games in the Western Hemisphere following the 1932 Lake Placid Games. And of course, as is true throughout the Olympic movement, it's really noteworthy how much they grew over the decades. In 1932, there were 252 athletes, 17 teams. And by the time the 1960 games came around, 665 athletes, 30 teams. And actually, the 1960 games were slightly smaller than the 1956 games in Cortina, Italy, because it was so hard to get to Northern California, and because the resort, Palisades Tahoe now, it was a brand new resort. It literally did not exist in any meaningful form when California was awarded the 1960 games, and we can talk about that a little bit. So in 1960, the women's speed skating made the debut in the Olympic Winter Games. And so that led to several decades later, to Bonnie making her appearances, and also men's biathlon made its debut in the 1960 games. One thing that's unusual about the games in 1960 is that bobsled was not a competition. It's the only Olympic Winter Games where bobsled was not hosted, and the reason for that was cost. There was no bobsled venue there, and as we've seen, even in the 2026 Winter Games, building a sliding venue is very costly. And in the end, the organizers, the state of California, decided not to do it. The Bobsled Federation was very upset, but there was no bobsled competition in 1960.
So if I can ask you to back up for a second,
Yeah.
why was California awarded the games if there really wasn't a venue and resources to do it well?
Well, essentially, it was a commercial proposition for the developers of the resort that became Palisades Tahoe many years later. In the mid 1940s, a skier named Wayne Polson and a lawyer, friend of his, Alexander Cushing, they essentially were, they were up in the Sierra, they were skiing, and they found this valley and a mountain nearby that they had a vision to develop. And so at the time in 1950, the early 1950s, 1955, when California was awarded the games, there really was only a chairlift, two rope tows, and a very small lodge there at what was then called Squaw Valley. And some would say that the Americans went to the IOC, the meeting in Europe, and gave them a really strong sales job to convince them to award the games. But there was basically nothing there at the time the games were awarded in 1955. In fact, the IOC had second thoughts throughout the next year. They threatened to pull the games from California, and basically made the state and eventually the U.S. federal government commit to put up money to develop the arena, the speed skating oval, the ski jump venue, Olympic Village facilities, and for that matter, highways. It was a big operation. And so last year in the Journal of Olympic History, the paper I wrote was essentially about the financial disaster that were these games. They were very successful for the athletes that were there and for the attendees. Everybody who looks back at them, who attended them, had a very positive experience, but it was a political controversy and a real financial disaster because there was nothing there. And of course, it became an anchor, not just for that resort at Palisades Tahoe, but really for all around Lake Tahoe, the ski and snow industry that exists there now. So it did have positive benefits looking ahead, but very costly at the time.
Do you think that that had an impact on any other cities that were considering putting in a bid?
I think that what we've seen, and I cover finance and the Olympic movement, and that's my professional life. As you mentioned, I work on the state side of working with our local jurisdictions preparing to host the 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games. But I think that 1960 was really one of the first times that jurisdictions began to recognize the financial perils of hosting an Olympics. And of course, the early Winter Olympic Games were much smaller. They were in places like San Moritz that had some developed tourist infrastructure. And what we've seen in subsequent decades is that you sometimes have countries and cities that bid to host the Olympics that are not prepared. And that was the case in 1960. And you see that, going through the decades, and it has led to essentially what we've seen most recently with cities like Paris and LA and even Milan and Cortina in this year, basically trying to use existing facilities, not to commit public funds to build expensive new infrastructure.
Right. That all makes sense. Well, I'm glad to hear that it sounds like from an athlete perspective, the games were still successful in
Yes.
1960.
Yes, a lot of great action. It was really the first version of the Miracle on Ice, with a really exciting game between the U.S. and Soviet Union and ice hockey. And it was 1950. The 1956 Winter Games in Italy were the first ones to have live television to much of the world, and of course that continued with the 1960 Games. So more and more people were seeing the Olympic Winter Games, seeing parts of it live, and getting in the excitement of all the events.
Right. Bonnie, I'm curious, did you ever know or talk to any athletes who competed there? Was that anything that you heard about?
From 1960, no, and really my first remembrance of the Olympics, and although I knew it kind of growing up in a sport, but what I first really remember is watching 1980 in Lake Placid and watching Eric Heiden. I even vaguely remember the hockey, but I obviously was a little bit more geared towards Eric Heiden and, watching in my TV room. And I actually took part in our Olympic trials for that Olympic team kind of by happenstance. And, watching it thinking, oh my gosh, maybe one day I could go to the Olympics. So that, 1980 was really my first time of really remembering a lot about the Olympic Games.
That's fair. Bob, do you have any comments on putting those 1960 games into the context of the larger history of the Winter Games?
Well, as Jason said, they had their historic moments, and he outlined them pretty well. I do want to go back to one comment that Jason made, and that was about the first television at the Cortina Games, same place they're going to be held next time. You know, the this is the infancy of the television industry, and the Italians, yes, they did attempt to televise those games, and they did, but the beam reached only so far, so it was a very limited audience, and this would not become live to the world until they got the satellite television, and it came in with the 1964 Olympics in Tokyo, and but of course, parallel to that triumph of the American hockey team over the Soviets, people forget that they also beat the Canadians only by one goal, and finally in the goal, and these were in the preliminary rounds, and in the final they beat the Czechs by 5 goals, I think, 4 or 5 goals, something like that, a big margin. Uh, but I remember watching uh, some of the TV because CBS televised those games, and these were the first games that television rights had ever been sold for. CBS paid $50,000 for them. Uh, Now we're up into the millions and looking at the trillions in terms of what the television industry is going to return to something to do with the Olympics, both winter and summer together over a quadrennial period.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So, Bonnie, I'd like to come to you next. And my first question is just, can you talk to us about what the Winter Games mean to you as an athlete?
Yeah, I think maybe even just as a female athlete, I think
Sure.
female athletics has really come a long way. And just the Olympic movement as a whole, I think has really given women's sports more of a leg to stand on. So, where, I think I come from a large family and all of them being very competitive. My oldest sister, Mary, we're going to play cards until she wins. So, you just let her win so you can go to bed. So, having those competitive juices, my sisters didn't have a lot of avenues to get involved in sports. So that was one way where, a coach happened to see them at a public session and told them to come join the sport, and they did. But, I think that was one of the ways where women's sports really can shine is through the Olympic movement. And yes, as years have come with Title IX and colleges and having scholarships and things like that, it's given women's sports a little bit more of a leg to stand on. But I just think as an overlooking thing, the Olympic movement has really done a ton for women's sports. So for me that's pretty exciting that I had that avenue to go down and that path to be in. And yeah, you know, the sport of speed skating was something that was in our family. And where my dad was a timer on the finish line, my mom was a judge. And that's different than being like a judge in figure skating. It was more like who came across the finish line first, second, or third. So a little bit different, but it was a family sport where everybody was involved in being part of it. So I just can't say enough about the Olympic movement itself. And we're kind of a lot of those obscure sports, so to speak, for the most part. Yes, in summer you have your track and field and your gymnastics and your basketball and things like that. But a lot of sports like mine, they're not collegiately out there for anybody. So it's really an expensive hobby for our families and our parents, and to really jump in full force in order to do that. But it just gives us another avenue where years back, a lot of females didn't have those avenues to go down.
Well, and I imagine it takes a whole family for practices and competitions and everything else. It's not really something you can, I would imagine, be that successful at without the support of a family.
Yeah, I think probably like anything in life, it always takes a village, right? But the more that you can be involved and be part of it, uh, the more it means to everybody else. Like I know my family sitting in the stands. My brothers and sisters had all been either national or North American champions. So they had kind of been down that road, but had never taken it as far as I did. But they knew what it was all about, and having lived and breathed it through their own way, and then to be there and then live it through me, I think was also pretty special for all of them.
That's fair. Well, speaking of that, can you talk a little bit about how competing in the Olympics differed from other competitions, whether it was world championships or international competitions?
I think the biggest part is just all the sports coming together, which is so exciting. And for those of us a little older here on the phone call, maybe Lindsay, you don't even fall into that category. I don't know, but I remember my first Olympic Games in Sarajevo. And, the cafeteria is where everybody goes, all the countries, all the sports. And one day I got to have lunch with Scott Hamilton and Stephen Phil Mayer. And I thought I had died and gone to heaven. And having gotten to know those guys over the course of the years, they don't remember that lunch. But this kid, who was a wide-eyed kid coming into her first Olympic Games, that is a clear, vivid moment that I'll never forget. So I think just having so many people come together, and idols and people that you looked up to, all being really under one roof at one time. And then not just only your country, but all the countries coming together is just super cool. So, when we have world championships and world cups and all that, you're just with your speed skating groups. So to be able to add all that extra element to it, but it's also can be overwhelming, especially for somebody coming into the Olympic Games for the first time. So, I think if there would have been video of my first race, well, my only race in Sarajevo, I got eighth. You probably would have thought I won, because I came across the finish line and threw up my arms. And but I finished eighth in that race. But I thought if I got anywhere near 12th, that would have been awesome. So eighth to me was like winning. But it's just, it's just something that is so much bigger than what you're really then expecting, right? And then you're there and you're living it. And, after kind of being in there and getting a taste of it, then as I went to other competitions along the way, I tried to always put myself back in that moment, because when I got to the Olympics, I didn't want it to be any different. I wanted then really every race for me to be like the Olympic Games, so that when you get there, you're not as overwhelmed. And that's, kind of hard to do with a lot of competitions. It's your family, it's your parents, there's 50 people there, and that's about it. So, but, trying to visualize different things, or going through, um, maybe rituals. I don't know if even that's the right word, but trying to do things in a normal, consistent way, so that when I get to the Olympics, I do it that exact same way. But also knowing in Albertville, when our race was delayed an hour, to then not get out of my sync. I needed to like stay in and think, oh, even though it's an hour earlier, now do I keep going? No, I have to adjust. So you always have to be willing to adjust, but knowing that you can have something you feel comfortable with to get you ready for those competitions is super important.
I imagine it would be sort of that psychological component. separate from the physical piece. I also wanted to ask you if you can talk to us about what it was like to be a flag bearer.
Oh, a terrific honor. I was the flag bearer for the 1988 closing ceremonies in Calgary, as well as the closing ceremonies in 1992. And in 1998, they brought sand into the stadium because there was no snow in Calgary. So they were trying to make it look like there was snow, but it was white sand, and it was not easy to carry a flag and be walking in sand. So that part was a little bit of a challenge. And then in 1992, you walk in with all the other flag bearers. When it's opening ceremonies, you walk in with your team. So you're all there together. But when it's closing ceremonies, all the flag bearers come in together at once, and then all the Olympic teams all come together as a cluster, kind of like we're all one. And so, but then you go and you put your flag there, and you're standing there with all the other flag bearers, and I'm like, but everybody's down there, they're all having fun. So in one respect, it was a little bit lonely, but such an honor, because how that comes to be is every national governing body, every sport has we would designate a captain for our team. And then as a captain, we would vote on who we think should be the flag bearer for opening ceremonies. And then those captains go to a meeting with the other captains of all the sports. And I believe it's you vote on somebody, but not from your sport. And then, there's a process of how they vote on it to get to be the flag bearer for that. And then they do the exact same thing for closing ceremonies. So to really feel that, our whole delegation um, picked me to represent them was definitely an honor. And I got to do that twice. So um, for sure, something I'm very proud of. And
Yeah.
emotional love. Sorry.
No, emotional is good. It's good. I mean, 30 years later, and it's still that significant for you. I'm just honored that you would share that with us today.
Thank you.
So, well, I also want to take a moment and look forward. So the Milano Cortina Games are going to be starting in just a couple weeks, and I would love to hear from each of the three of you. Sort of, what are you most excited about for this next iteration of the Winter Games that are just about to start? What are you going to watch? What are you looking forward to? So, Bob, would you like to weigh in on that?
Well, I always look forward to the hockey confrontations, but because there's a lot of parity now in ice hockey in European countries, relative with the United States and Canada. So I'm looking forward to that. But I'm particularly fascinated by not particularly the skiing events, but the skiing events in terms of Nordic competitions. I love to see the ski jumping, which I've witnessed to some extent in Lake Placid on a number of occasions. I love that event, and I've been caught up by the biathlon in the last decade. Boy, how those folks handle the steadiness of rifle shooting and the tremendous will to forge on in those long cross country skis that they do. So I'm looking forward to that a lot. And there are two things. I'm a nationalist when it comes to watching the Olympic Games. I was born in New England, and I follow the United States religiously in the Olympic Games, except for two events in the Winter Games, and that's ice hockey for men and women, and it's curling for men and women. And if they don't win, I'm disappointed. Other than that, I root for the American participants 100%. And but like Barney draws a wonderful picture. I enjoyed listening to her. about the Olympic Games to the athlete and to the fans too. I've noted the exuberance that goes on in those Olympic precincts. If you haven't attended an Olympic Games in your life, winter or summer, and you have an opportunity to do so, do so. You'll never forget it. It'll be one of the outstanding experiences in your life.
I imagine so. I think I'm the only one on this call right now who has not had that opportunity yet. So, Jason, I know your camera's not working, but I would still love to hear from you. What are you looking forward to for the upcoming Olympic and Paralympic Games?
Yes, Ilya Malining in figure skating for the U.S. really has the opportunity to create a really electric moment for the world. Such an incredible athlete. I'm going to be in Milan. The plans are still being worked on, but as part of LA 28's delegation of state and local officials who are observing the operations of the games. So, in addition to seeing some really star athletes, I'll be nerding out on the organization and operation of this huge event.
Excellent. It's hard to imagine everything that must go into putting on a successful games.
Oh yeah, I mean, in terms of my work in public management and public finance, these events, they involve every aspect of government, security, they involve transportation, but one of the things that I'm learning here in California is, they involve our entities that license doctors. There are doctors and medical professionals coming from around the world. We have, for the summer games, we'll have horses who will come in, which involves a government operation that monitors that. So it's really just really beyond any other event that's hosted in the world, and just a huge operation for governments.
Yeah. All those things that you don't think about until you have to have an answer to. How do we get horses in?
Right, right.
Yeah. Bonnie, what about you? What are you looking forward to? And you'll be in Milan as well.
I will be there for part of the games, not the whole entire time, but I think outside my sport, and one thing we kind of talked about before our whole program started here, Lindsay Vaughn and just what she's done, and her comeback is pretty special. We'll be watching her, Michaela Schifrin, and like Bob, I have a son that plays semi-pro hockey, so I'm kind of all in as a hockey person. And, of course, go Team USA, but like any team is going to be awesome there to watch. And then when we look at our sport for short track, so for some names of those out there, looking for those that have the potential to be on a medal podium, we've got Corinne Stoddard in short track, as well as Kristen Santos Griswold. And then on the long track side, we have reigning gold medalist Erin Jackson. And although in the 500, and although she's been on the podium quite a few times this season, there's been a Dutch girl that's been so dominant, and I don't think has lost a 500 in the last 2 years. So she's got her work cut out for her there, but also qualified very strongly in the 1,000 during our Olympic trials. Then we've got Brittany Bowe, or as I like to say, B squared, another B squared. 500,000 for her. She's the 1,000-meter world record holder, and she'll also participate in the team pursuit. And then on the men's side, our men's team pursuit team is the world record holder there. Undefeated so far this season in World Cups, so a really great strong shot for winning gold there. And Jordan Stoltz, this kid from the Wisconsin area here, young kid that has a realistic shot of bringing home 4 medals, and they could potentially all be gold. So 500,000, 1,500 mass start. So we've got a strong team going into the games, and looking very much forward to seeing how they all react to being at the Olympics again, because as we just discussed, it can be different. So, but it can be so super thrilling as well.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Sounds like it. Well, we have gotten some great questions in from our audience, so I'd like to take our last few minutes and ask some of those. So one that actually came in advance was, what are your thoughts on the debate about moving some of the indoor summer sports to the Winter Olympics? So I'm very curious, Bob, what do you think about that, about moving some summer sports into the Winter Games?
Well, I'm torn. I think older people are usually more resistant to change than younger people. But the world is moving towards the younger position. And certainly these movements are backed by considerations of finance, facilities, reduced costs. There's no doubt about that. And but I but I still like the demarcation between the winter sports and the summer sports. I think it's a good model, and it captures my interest more if the deck starts to be shuffled, for instance, of all the sports coming together. I can understand some of the reasons behind it, but I'm not too enthusiastic about that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Jason, Bonnie, do either of you have strong feelings about this?
You
You
know,
can go first, Jason.
basically the same as Bob. I'm skeptical. I think it would depend, on the sport and the execution. I mean, I think there probably is some opportunity there, but like he said, as we get older, change becomes harder. So there's that.
That's fair.
Yeah, the only other thing that I would say in regards to that is, just the massive costs that come with hosting an Olympics. And, are they going to be moving a little bit more towards using cities that already have a lot of those infrastructures there to not put the cost so much on these new cities that want to host something, and all that money is spent going that direction. So that's not necessarily merging the two, but it's more in regards to trying to maybe keep some of the costs down and going back to cities that have already had them before.
Makes sense. That makes sense. Well, our next question, Jason, I think this will probably be for you. Can you talk a little bit about what role Walt Disney played in the 1960 Winter Games?
Sure. And I saw one of the attendees here, Jim Goddard, who he recently authored an article in the Journal of Olympic History about the torch relay in 1960, which came from Europe and went all up and down California. Walt Disney and his staff had a role in presenting that. And so California is an entertainment state, and Hollywood is essentially one of our largest industries. It has a lot of glamour and money, of course, but also employs a lot of hardworking Californians. And so by 1960, Hollywood and for that matter, Walt Disney Studios and the Walt Disney Company were already a big part of California life and politics and culture. And so in a way, it was kind of natural that California would turn to Disney to help put together the games. His title was pageantry chairman of the organizing committee. And in that role, like I said, he and his team had a role of putting together the torch relay. One of his designers had a lead role in designing the Olympic torch that was used. He also had a big role in designing the opening and closing ceremony of the 1960 games. And one of the most interesting things in the pictures you see is all around the valley where the Olympics were held. Walt Disney organized cities around the state to purchase what were called snow sculptures. They were really kind of these metal and wooden frames that were surrounded by icy snow. Cities paid a few $1,000s each, and these were all over essentially the grounds of the Olympic host there in the Tahoe region, and so they depicted various of the winter sports. Sacramento had a sculpture, Palm Springs had a sculpture, and so on. So it was a positive role, most people thought, but it really is just one of those things with California games. And I'm sure that in 2028, you will see a ton of Hollywood stars being involved in the games because that's kind of what we do in California.
I imagine so. I imagine so. Another question that has come in, could Dr. Barney elaborate on Pierre de Coubertin's vision of the Winter Games? And could you speculate on what Coubertin might say about the games today? Would he be happy with the direction they've gone and massive participation?
He would be happy with the massive participation. He would be happy with the growth. He would be not happy with the commercialization of the games, which he deplored and started to rail against as early as 1920. Uh, so it would be a mixed bag, which if he came back to life and beheld these things, of course he'd be amazed. He would probably have a semi-heart attack in some respects. Uh, but but nevertheless, he would look at the values that the Winter Games bring to bringing people together, in terms of the spectators and in terms of the participants, in terms of the officials, in terms of the organizers, the people around the world that know that five-ring symbol, know what it stands for. It's as recognizable as the Red Cross symbol for the Red Cross, I think. As he'd be happy with that, and because he was the architect of the five-ring symbol, he drew it, he promoted it, and he has seen what it has done. It's been like a pumping oil well for the revenues needed to support the Olympic Games and to support the expansion of it with its resources. So I think the bottom line for him, he'd be happier than he would be sadder, but he would be vastly surprised.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Another question that has come in through the chat. I'm not sure who would be best placed to answer this one. How did the IOC handle Denver giving up the games, and how did this affect future bidding processes?
Do you want me to respond to that?
Sure.
Well, Denver was awarded those games in 1970, and everybody was eager to get on with it. But as the preparations unfolded, there was a steady rise in public dissent against the games. Oh, the revenues didn't match the expenses, and there were particular impacts on the environment, on the physical environment being disturbed by the building of Olympic facilities, both skiing downhill and in the Nordic events. This resentment ended up in a referendum, a municipal referendum, in which it was decided that the public would demand it, that no public monies be put towards these games. Without the public monies, the games couldn't go on. So reluctantly, the organizing committee bent to that wish, turned the games back to the IOC with much apologies, and only about a year and a half before the games were ready to be scheduled. Now, the IOC was darn lucky. There's Innsbruck sitting there. They had in Austria a big rail center in the Tyrolean Alps, and all its facilities still in place, underused, but still in place. And they had the experience of having put on the Winter Games in 1964, which had been very successful. And so uh, they turned to the Austrians to help solve the question. And the Austrians accepted the responsibility. And so the IOC got out of a very difficult predicament. Now, Denver, since recently, was a candidate for the Winter Olympic Games within the United States. Now, they didn't get them because Salt Lake City got them. But out of that rose a movement which was successful in the end of establishing an election bylaw prohibiting any public monies from being associated with either a bid or the organization of the Olympic Games if public monies were to be involved. And there would have to be a referendum right at that point. And that's a law that's on the books, not only now, but for decades into the future, and can only be overturned by a two-thirds vote in a referendum. Unlikely to happen, perhaps. What are the implications of that? The implications of that is if public monies shrink in terms of supporting the revenues needed for the Olympic Games, what is the alternative? The alternative is more private funding. And what is that? A wider expansion of commercialism taking over all sorts of maybe institutions of the Olympic Games, like advertising in the venues, for instance, the competitive venues, which is excluded now. So that's my take on that question you asked.
That's a very thoughtful take, and it's true. There are often unintended consequences, like the additional commercialization that could come to pass. So. Well, I want to thank all of our speakers for being here today, and I want to thank everyone who's joined us online for this program. I think it's been a really fascinating discussion. I've appreciated hearing the historical perspectives as well as the athlete perspective from Barney. I would also like to thank the International Society of Olympic Historians for partnering with the museum on this. And I would like to invite everyone to come visit the museum. When you come visit the museum in Colorado Springs, you can actually see Bonnie's speed suit. It is currently on display, as well as a pair of her skates. And I want to wish the best of luck to all the athletes that are going to be competing in the next iteration of the Olympic Winter Games in Milano Cortina here in just a few weeks. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.